Hello, everyone. Today, we are privileged to have Dr. Azra Raza as the guest speaker at our fiction book club. Her CV and website will be given in the description. Dr. Azra Raza is a clinician who sees about 30 to 40 patients every week. She is also a remarkable scientist. Her research focuses on acute myeloid leukemia and most importantly on a precancerous condition called myelodysplastic syndrome. In fact, Azra Appa is the director of Myelodysplastic Syndrome Center at the Columbia University. She has published in extremely high quality journals like the New England Journal of Medicine, Nature, and many others. Today, we will start our conversation with her critically acclaimed book, The First Cell, and the human cost of pursuing cancer to the last. This book is a wonderful combination of arts and science. She raises the concern that cancer-related research in animals and cell lines is not being translated effectively into humans. She proposes something that is very logical and obvious, like preventing the appearance of first cancer cell by finding its earliest footprint. And yet, this proposition seems quite radical as she explains her journey in this marvelous book, The First Cell. We will talk about animal models and diagnostic tests in light of this book. Let me first welcome her with certain set of questions related to animal models. In your professional opinion, what value does animal models have in cancer treatment nowadays? What direction you want the animal research to take? Do you have any preference in animal models, or are you completely dissatisfied, rather against animal research? Welcome.
Thank you so much, Jamshed, for having me at your wonderful forum. I must admit that because I'm from Karachi, anything to do with Karachi brings extreme joy to my heart. So I woke up feeling really excited and happy that I'll be connecting to all of you today. In fact, I was texting with my daughter earlier, who lives in New York also, and I was telling her that it's such a joyful day for me to start like this. Thank you for the very kind introduction also. And I'm so glad that you started by asking this question about animal models, Jamshed. The book First Cell I wrote is owed absolutely to my criticism of exactly this approach to try and develop therapies for cancer. And to give you just a very brief background, I'm very good friends with John Brockman, who also happens to be an agent for authors in science. But in New York, we became very good friends once I moved here. He gives out an annual question to about 150 intellectuals in the world, both in the arts and sciences. And I believe it was 2016 or 17 when he came up with the question, what important idea in science should be retired? And I answered by saying that the mouse is the real elephant in the room. We have to retire mouse models. Now, in this answering this question, were people like Richard Dawkins, Steven Pinker, Daniel Dennett, Carlo Rovelli, I mean, all kinds of famous people. Yet my answer was picked up as the #1 answer and headlined by The Guardian and New York Times, everywhere, that here is the first criticism which was so direct. And the point I was making was that we develop therapies in these animal models and we cure mice and then we bring them to the bedside and they're not helping. 95% of drugs that are brought this way fail. Why? Because let's say we take a mouse and we want to study acute leukemia in this mouse. Well, the mouse doesn't get acute leukemia spontaneously. So what we do is we take some acute leukemia cells from the bone marrow of a patient. Then we want to grow them in the mouse, but the mouse's immune system will reject those cells. So first we kill the mouse's immune system completely. Then we put these cells, they start growing. God knows what's growing in there now. And now we treat the mouse with some drugs and it responds. Well, that's just too artificial. However, I want to be very clear about it. I am totally against the development of treatment in mice, but I'm not against using animals to study physiology and other kinds of pathology and gene function, mechanism of action, all kinds of things that can be done. And I will show some of the ways that I use mouse models also, but not that I use them, but that I support use of those mouse models. Just not for drug development, because what you see in mice cannot be translated to humans, as you said.
Wonderful. And the addition I have, you also mentioned exactly what you said. On page 168, you mentioned that animal models could be used for gene interaction, signaling pathways, but it is the therapy driven for humans that you are against. So thank you for clarifying your position.
Yes.
Now, my next question is about the cost. The cost for pre-cancerous tests that you are recommending, a whole battery of tests that you recommend as a situation for for detecting the correct patient.
Well, the cost, I think, is depends upon how rapidly we can scale it up for use. Right now, I'm not recommending any tests, but they are coming. And the way I think about it, Jamshed, is that the cost of an early computer was very high. The cost of sequencing the genome was several $1 billion. Today, you can sequence the genome in $250, not $2 billion. It depends upon how relevant things are. So once the word processor came into use, no one cares about the typewriter, first of all. And then look at how cheap this little thing is now, few $100s, and this handheld telephone computer is more powerful than the largest computer which occupied a room in 1970s. So I think that the cost will come down very quickly. I'm not worried about it.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
In fact, let me qualify one more thing. My whole life has been devoted to developing a kind of technology that can be applied globally and universally from Asia and Africa to the US. We should not be developing therapies that cost millions of dollars that can only treat a few individuals in developed countries, and even there bring their healthcare systems on the verge of a collapse. So my life is devoted to developing cheap and applicable therapies and detection methods.
Okay. Would you like to comment on the role of FDA? Because you also mentioned that FDA approves things based on scanty evidence. So what do you mean by scanty evidence?
I absolutely criticize the FDA and the NCI because these are institutions, Jamshed, whose job is to protect patients. But I feel that they abdicate their responsibilities. Why? Because FDA, for example, is under immense pressure by patients, families, advocacy groups, organizations like Leukemia, Lymphoma Society, Myeloma Society. Why? Because all of these people are demanding from the FDA, how come you're not approving drugs for cancer? There's so much pressure on them. Then there's pressure from the pharmaceutical industry. So it has come to the point where the FDA keeps lowering its bar for approving a drug, to the point that today, if you can show that survival is improved by 2.1 months for 30% patients, 2.1 months median, which means half of them won't even get that, drug is approved. No, not just that. If you can shrink a tumor and show that the disease did not progress, so the progression-free survival is 2 months, you get a drug approved that costs $150,000 a year. This is what I mean by the kind of responsibilities that the FDA is failing spectacularly in.
Okay, and it takes guts to say these things loudly, and you may be paying the price for that, because you also mentioned the funding issues that you faced, and then finally you were able to grab some of the grants. Okay, so my question is, consider it a counter argument. Even the drugs that showed miraculous results, and you mentioned some of the case studies over here, even those drugs, you got those drugs based on animal models, and then cell lines, and then clinical trials were done, right? So even those drugs that have wonderful results in certain population of patients, they came from that pathway. So I get your point, that pathway, you have objections to that pathway, but even the drugs that you have, they came from those pathways. So what do you have to say about that?
I have to say that in the disease that I'm treating, pre-leukemia, and in the disease I treat, acute myeloid leukemia, except for one drug which I brought to the bedside based on human studies, all the other FDA-approved drugs have come to the bedside not by logical development through mouse models and clinical trials, but by serendipity, by total serendipity, trial and error. So let me give you the drugs that are approved. Luspatercept, the latest drug that got approved to improve anemia in these patients. You know what happened? This drug was actually approved by a company for improving bone growth. And when they gave it to patients who have lesions which have rarefied bones, lytic lesions, holes develop in the bones, they wanted to give it to those individuals to see if the bone would grow. When they gave it, what they noticed was that bone didn't grow, but their hemoglobin went up to 20 grams. They had to do bloodletting on these patients. That's why it occurred to someone, oh, this could improve anemia. Let's give it to patients with MDS. That's how this drug arrived by the bedside. Second drug, which is approved, class of drugs that is the oldest that has been approved, hypomethylating agents, Vidasa, decitabine, and Cobi. All three are derived from just one parent drug. How did they arrive? Well, it was noticed that some of these drugs, azacitidine, 5-azacitidine, they can get into the DNA and they can cause removal of methylation groups because they replace the methylated cytosine. They thought this drug would work in cancer, so they gave it to, it's like chemotherapy. Chemotherapy is thrown at all the cancer patients. They gave it to, when I was a fellow in training, I gave it to ovarian cancer, lung cancer, prostate cancer, liver cancer, and bone marrow cancers. And the only place it worked was in MDS, which is a pre-cancer. You see? So that's how that drug, those classes of drugs arrived. The only drug that has arrived in MDS bedside, and everybody admits it, is because of my work. I studied cell kinetics in the bone marrow of these patients. I showed that even though these patients present with low blood counts, their bone marrow is very active, very rapidly proliferative. So I said, well, where are these cells going? If the bone marrow is producing so many cells, Why is there a paucity of these cells in the blood? And I showed that they're dying. And then I showed they're dying because there is an excess amount of a protein called tumor necrosis factor. I said, well, if we just lower tumor necrosis factor, then these cells won't die and the blood counts will improve. But there was no anti-TNF drug, Jamshed, at that time. The first anti-TNF drug that came to market was a drug called thalidomide, which was approved for use in leprosy in America in 1998. But I knew its mechanism of action is anti-TNF, and that's what I needed for MDS. So imagine a drug approved for leprosy. I went and begged them to give me the drug. They gave it to me, and I was the first to use it in MDS and showed that 20% patients responded. And that led to the development of then the analog Revlimid. That's what's approved, and that is what is used. I tell the story in the book also, but this is the only drug that arrived by the bedside, and it had nothing, zero to do with mice. In fact, in mice, thalidomide proved to have no effect, and people thought, oh, it's the safest drug to give. And they started giving it to patients, and then some pregnant women took it, and they gave birth to babies tragically without developed limbs. So my studies in thalidomide were completely misleading, but human studies in thalidomide showed that it could be used for things as disparate as leprosy and a pre-leukemia.
Wonderful. And for the audience, you can read this story. This is mentioned in the First Cell book as well. So I have another question. Consider it a counter argument. For example, you believe in healing, not just curing or treating patients, right? So you develop some intimate relationship. I shouldn't say intimate, but sort of a relationship with the doctor that typical doctors don't develop. That I get from it. So your patients, they might agree for a test drug that hasn't been tested properly in animals and cell lines. So they can agree, if you talk to them, they might agree to be a guinea pig. But what about rest of the population? Will they agree to take certain therapy that has never been tested on animals and cell lines and others?
I think it's a very excellent and profound question you're asking about the ethics. I don't think we should take this lightly. The fact that I have the word you used is correct, intimate relationship with my patients. Why? Because pre-leukemia patients don't die very quickly. It's a universally fatal illness, but not all of them are going to die within 6 months. In fact, some live for years and years, where I keep giving them blood transfusions, a little therapy here, they respond for 6 months, then another 8 months here. So I'm going through a profound journey as they traverse the natural history of their disease. So I'm seeing them once a week in my clinic for years. In fact, I see some of these patients more often than I see my family members, because they regularly have to come once a week. They're getting transfused. Now imagine doing this for years. Of course, I develop a relationship. Of course, they listen to me, but it's not up to me to simply offer a drug and they'll take it. It's not how things are done. Everything has to go through 15,000 committees first to be approved. So it's not like I can simply convince patients. On the other hand, I have to say that when cancer reaches an end stage, everybody is desperate. And even if you tell someone that your son, who's 30 years old, is going to die within 3 months, that mother is going to say, Dr. Raza, do anything you can, even if there's 1 in a million chance to it. That's the state of desperation. And this is why drugs even improving survival for 2 months, because my colleagues constantly tell me, but Azra, those 2 months meant so much to my patients. Yes, those 2 months, every day that you can add is important. But then at what cost are we doing it? Because the 90% patients who did not respond at all, but suffered all the side effects, including the physical toxicity and financial toxicity of the drug. What about the expense of those 90% patients because of they suffer because 10% patients can live for 2 months longer? That's what I am saying. I'm not saying 2 months are not important. So patients are desperate, they're ready to take anything. That puts the burden even more on us, that we shouldn't even offer them things which have so little to add and damage so many people, 90 people, to benefit 10 people for a few months. That's my criticism. But this is not the way it is being looked at. When you look at a larger perspective of the field, it's a completely obscene point of research that we have arrived at, both financially and physically, what we are doing to patients. It's unacceptable.
Okay. What are your thoughts on using some of the natural products and some of the folkloric remedies? What is the harm of trying some of those therapies? So do you have some anecdotes to tell, or what is your point of view?
I am 100% completely against them. Until and unless there is proof to show in seriously conducted trials, none of these things are acceptable to me, and they can harm.
Okay. So since this is being live streamed, so we are getting questions from the live stream as well. Some of the questions are very basic. For example, Fiza Javed, in the live stream, she has the question, how does the first cancer cell come from? So it's up to you if you would like to entertain that question.
Yes, I would love to entertain that question. Jamshed, is it okay if I show a couple of slides here?
Wonderful, wonderful. It's completely up to you.
Okay. Because we have some time. It's only, we are together for an hour?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So would I be able to share my screen?
Yes, yes. You have the co-host privileges. You can.
I do. Okay, so let me try. Who asked me the question? Fiza?
Fiza Javed from the live stream.
Okay. Darling, can you see my slides? Can you see this?
Yes, yes. Perfectly, perfectly.
Before we ask question, because what Fiza is asking is a very important and a very serious question, and I would like to address it in a more formal way. Because she said, how is a first cell even born? It's an incredibly important question. I thought, because I'm talking to young people today, I'd talk a little bit about how I have spent my life doing this work and what is not just the science, but the art of medicine and of science. So guys, I went to school in Karachi, Dow Medical College, and came to America as a 24-year-old and landed in Buffalo, New York. And immediately, within 2 weeks of arrival, I was at Roswell Park Cancer Institute seeking an opportunity to engage in research, because at 24, I was sure I'll be able to cure cancer in a few years. So I arrived at Roswell Park Cancer Institute in Buffalo. I had gone to Buffalo because I had siblings living there, my sister and brother. So as I walked into the lobby, this is what was written on the lobby. If I had my choice between a moonwalk and saving the life of a single child with leukemia, I would never glance upward. Said by James Grace, who was the ex-director of the institute. It became like a defining moment for me, Jamshed, because these lines epitomized what I had come to do to America. And I felt that, wow, this is the right place for me now. This is where I should work. And So I'm going to take just a few minutes to tell you what I do, how I do it, and why I do it, because equally important. So what I do is, Jamshed already said, I see 30 to 40 cancer patients every week. I supervise a basic research lab. But to learn about the art of clinical practice, perhaps one has to stand on both sides of the bed. So one of my credentials is that I'm also a cancer widow. My husband, who was the head of the cancer center at the university in Chicago, in a cruel twist of irony, got the very leukemia he was trying to cure all his life, and died after a 5-year tormented battle. I thought I'll begin by telling you about the case of Andrew, which is very much covered in the book. But basically, in July of 2016, he develops tingling in his arm. He starts to exercise, weakness develops. He's taken to the emergency room. He was quadriplegic within hours. Neurosurgeons could remove only 90% of this 9-centimeter large glioblastoma multiforme, the deadliest brain tumor known to mankind. Now, from this moment on, all his treating oncologists, which included me, knew that his prognosis is hopeless. Yet what followed? Extensive surgeries, placement of a shunt, intensive rounds of aggressive chemo, radiation therapies, immune manipulations, more chemo, more radiation, more immune therapies. He suffered unbearable toxicities and the tumors continued to grow. We knew that would happen, yet we kept giving him all this. We lost Andrew 5 years ago. 16 months from diagnosis. He was 23 years old. Imagine, he's diagnosed at 22, he's dead at 23. We failed Andrew. How badly we failed him. How badly. He died the most painful, tormented death imaginable. And to me, the most important thing is Andrew was a best friend of my daughter, Scheherazade. Now, Andrew was not her boyfriend. He was her best friend. Our Andrew was gay. He had gone to Paris in his final year of college for fashion design, came back to New York ready to work at Prada and Kenzo, and suddenly gets diagnosed with this horrifying brain tumor. His friends, Scheherazade, Charles, Rebecca, sat by his bedside for those 16 months watching him die. The children are all in psychotherapy today because it's impossible to go through this with your best friend and not be shaken at the roots of your being. Was it cruel to Andrew and his family to keep suggesting ineffective agents, which would give him a few additional months at best when the writing was on the wall? The question was, what are the alternatives? What should we have done? Should we have suggested no treatment, enjoy whatever time he had instead of vomiting his guts out? Well, if we did that, then the tumors would have grown. And death from, imagine a brain tumor growing in the skull where it can't expand, the headaches this poor boy had, the projectile vomiting he had. This is what I watch all the time. Was honesty even a choice? What was the honest thing? We are telling the mother of a 22-year-old that your son is going to die of cancer or dying of the treatment. The question I'm asking is, why are these the only choices in 2022? In fact, it's not just Andrew. The age-adjusted mortality today is the same as it was in 1930. Think of this, 1930 to today. Sure, there's a 1% decline in cancer deaths, but that parallels the rise and fall in smoking. So the decline in death rate is not from some magical treatment we have developed for cancer. It is from anti-smoking campaigns. So what are we patting ourselves on the back about? Sure, we cure 68% of cancers diagnosed. Yeah. My question is, with what? The same slash, poison, and burn. So what's new? Where has $1 trillion in research and 4.5 million papers, where have they gone? Why is there this dramatic failure, this staggering failure to use the insights developed into biology of cancer with $1 trillion and by publishing 4.5 million papers? Why is there such a failure to convert this into improved therapies? And if there is this problem, what are we doing wrong? Why aren't people questioning it? 95% experimental trials fail. Guys, I can't make up these statistics. They are so horrifying. The 5% that succeed, in my opinion, should have failed because the median improvement in survival from these drugs is 2 months. More than 90% resources are investing in trying to understand advanced metastatic cancer. So you see these 68% cancers we are treating and curing are ones that were detected early. That's it. But if someone is like Andrew, who presents with a tumor that's so big already, that's it. You can't do anything about it. And these advances are mostly in mice. I'm sorry. So this is the story I told you. This creature is what made me write the book, that we have to stop this madness. To keep doing the same thing and expect different results is the best definition of insanity. And this is why I wrote the book, The First Cell. So this is the question that Fiz asked. How are you going to catch what even causes the birth of the first cell? Stage 1, I'm saying, is already too late, right? Because stage 1, you have hundreds of millions of cells already in the tumor. So some people thought, what about if we get rid of all the cancer, can't see even microscopic disease, but watch it come back, recur? Maybe the recurrence actually recapitulates the initiation of cancer. Because the question you asked, no one is even looking at it seriously. How is the cancer cell born? I asked the same question, Fizza. What is it with Pakistanis? We ask the most fundamental question. These people are not even asking that question. They keep studying established cancers, metastatic cancer. They keep taking established cancers, putting them in mice. No, I'm interested in finding out. So one of my dearest friends, Ken Pienta, who is at Johns Hopkins University, who's at Johns Hopkins, built this little device working with biomedical engineers from Princeton. And basically, you can inject cancer cells from one end, and they travel through these microfluidics, and they land in these little diamonds where they start growing. One cell at a time lands in these, and they start growing. Once they're grown, you can inject chemotherapy from the other end. And that is delivered in a concentration going from high to low. So I'm going to just show you a slide about what happens. In this diamond, there was a lot of chemotherapy. In this diamond, no chemotherapy. Red and green cells are both prostate cancer cells. So look what happens when the cells were growing. Chemotherapy was delivered to this diamond and no chemotherapy here. This is the time elapsing. What you see is most of these cells have died and the field has become black, and here cells are growing. Well, recurrence starts with these rapidly moving giant cells that arrive out of nowhere. Red, green, these rapidly moving giant cells come. And with time, what you see is that they start giving birth to the little cells. It's the giant cells that arrive first, these rapidly moving, crazy giant cells. And now they are birthing little cells. And as time goes on, the whole field becomes filled with the small cells and the giant cells will disappear. So the question is, where do giant cells come from? Well, there are a couple of ways they can be formed. One is, under normal conditions, the cell doubles its DNA and then the nucleus divides and then the cell divides. But if there is some stress on a cell, the cell is going to die. It's being stressed by some damaging agent. the most vulnerable part of the cell when it can die is during mitosis. So cleverly, the cell doesn't undergo mitosis. It keeps synthesizing DNA. Even the nucleus can divide, but the cell doesn't divide. So now you develop a large giant cell with multiple nuclei in it. And that is what we saw in the previous film. I showed you that once you cleared everything of cancer, recurrence started somehow with giant cells appearing, because there were some little cells left that fused together, or a few little cells that did this phenomena, which we call endoreplication. So what are these giant cells, and how come no one is talking about them, can ask the question. Actually, giant cells have been described by Virchow in 1850s. Polyploid giant cancer cells, PGCCs, have been found very rarely in tumors, but you can isolate them from the blood. Their number increases after therapy because they're the ones that are causing recurrence. And they contribute to resistant and metastatic disease. I came upon these giant cells, Jamshed, by serendipity also. I was trying to CRISPR in a mutation in this gene. And when we did that, when we CRISPRed in a mutation in this gene SF3B1, in human leukemia cell line K562, I also treated with chemotherapy. What I saw was, like, these are happily growing leukemia cells in a dish. When we CRISPRed in the mutation, lots of giant cells appear. Here are happily growing cells. When we treat with chemotherapy, lots of giant cells appear. So we picked up the giant cells and tried to look at what they are. Wild type cells have one nucleus, giant cell has multiple nuclei. You see 3. In fact, when we did karyotyping, they were up to 16 nDNA, 32 nDNA, 32 little cells in one cell. Then we followed. We did something clever in my lab. We fixated our video camera on one giant cell in my lab, and we started following it. Do you see nothing happens, but at day 3, it suddenly starts giving birth to little cells. It's like a somatic cell pregnancy. Now we have got this phenomenon of somatic cell pregnancy, giant cell giving birth to little cells, over and over and over. And I published this extensively. You see, after a while, Jamshed, only the little cells are left, giant cells disappear. This is when we diagnose cancer. So we have missed all the early events by finding cancer at this point. And Fizza, to answer your question, this has been the problem. So how do I think cancer starts? I think that cancer starts because it's a stress response. Let's say liver gets an infection with hepatitis B virus. The virus infects cells and starts killing them. So the liver cells are now under a lot of pressure. Either you fight or flight. Either you develop a strategy to survive somehow with the virus around, or you're going to die. So you know what the cells do. It's a very clever thing. Stressed cell, like a liver cell, joins with a stressed blood cell and fuses. And this fused cell becomes a giant cell. So now you have a liver cell inside a blood cell, like a macrophage. A macrophage is a blood cell that arrives at areas of stress, and its job is to eat up dying cell. So this macrophage had come to the liver and was trying to eat the dying liver cell. Instead of dying, the liver cell goes in, joins its genome with the macrophage, and some re-engineering occurs. As a result, the two are now one. And you see, this solved 2 problems for me, this model. Why? Because Jamshed, when I was young and I started reading about cancer, what fascinated me was, number 1, within our body, we are giving birth to a new species that can live forever. So I said, wow, if I unlock the secret of cancer, I can unlock the secret of aging and immortality. That was my first intellectual fascination with cancer. The second was that If you consider the body as a state, cells are its citizens. Citizens have to follow rules. And one rule is that you stay where you were born. So liver cells have to stay in the liver, ovary cells in the ovary, heart cells in the heart. Only in one condition, cancer, these cells can walk out of the organ of origin, walk out of their homes. Liver cells can land in the blood. Ovarian cells can land in the brain. How are these cells walking? Now this explains it. Number one, by hiding inside a blood cell, the immune system is completely fooled. It keeps thinking this is a normal cell. That's how cancer can fool the immune system and grow. And secondly, it becomes mobile. It can enter blood, travel all over the body. And metastases occur mostly where bone marrow and blood formation occurs. The most common metastatic site is the bone marrow. Why? Because the macrophage homes to the bone marrow, takes the liver cell there. With time, this is how cancer is born. This is where we are diagnosing cancer, and the mother cell, the first cell, is alive and kicking. When we come in with treatment, Jamshed, we only kill those cells. The mother cell is not affected. Why? Because it came into existence to withstand adverse conditions. And so once it survives with time, this is what causes recurrence. To answer Fizza's questions now, I think that the entire field of cancer research is missing the point by concentrating on the last cell and not trying to find out and answer your question. How is the first cell born? The way I have been observing in my lab, the way I am seeing now, this is the model I'm presenting, that the first cell is not one cell even, it's two cells. It's a fused cell. It's a crazy thing, but that's what I'm saying, a radically different thing. Have I been able to show it? This is where I want to show why I started my career by studying acute leukemia. Within a few years, it was clear to me that in my lifetime, this disease won't be cured. So I said to myself, I should be looking instead at people who are at high risk of developing this disease, and then intercept. Don't let them develop the disease. Who are people at high risk? In 1984, I found these patients, pre-leukemia. They can develop acute leukemia. So I started focusing on studying these patients, trying to intercept. And that's the time I said, because I was from Pakistan, a young person, I was 32 at the time, I said to myself, wow, if I'm going to study these patients, I should save their samples. Now listen, if I had gone to school in this country, my next step would have been to try and develop a mouse model. Instead, I was an immigrant. I could think outside the box because my mind wasn't cluttered with this. So I made a very simple thing. The simple question Fizza asked, my simple thing was, why not save these samples to study them? Because that's how I started my tissue repository in 1984. Just putting bone marrow, blood, biopsies, saliva samples in my freezers. Today, I have more than 60,000 samples longitudinally obtained, which means as the patient goes from pre-leukemia to leukemia, serial samples are obtained and saved. Nobody in the world has done this. Nobody in the world has, as a single physician, not one cell is contributed by another oncologist. And more importantly, every vial in these freezers means something to me because I've taken care of these patients. I do the bone marrows to this day myself. I draw the blood myself. Now I'm working to do whole genome sequencing on the entire tissue repository, and we are studying serial plasma samples in such a way that 2 drops of blood are yielding more accurate information than a biopsy. Imagine, very soon we may never have to do those painful biopsies. What I learned from studying MDS is not a pre-leukemia, it's a malignant disease by itself. So we need to find a pre-MDS stage to find the first cell. I said, why not trap them in the blood? They are larger cells. We should be able to isolate them by size, literally use like a coffee filter technology. Pass blood through a filter, blood cells will go through, the large giant cells will be trapped. And so working with my friend Patrizia Paterlini from Pasteur Institute in France, she had developed this machine. I got this machine 7 years ago in my lab, started passing the blood of my patients through it, and started finding these giant cells. Look at this giant cell. This is a leukemia cell. Compare it to this giant cell with like 20 nuclei in it. Huge. And it's in the blood. In fact, they're always giving birth. You see how many nuclei. Now I have studied hundreds and hundreds of patients. This is the normal sized blood cell. Compare it to the giant cell that's filled with these and giving birth to them. I'm saying that this is the first cell, guys. I'm saying this is what we are missing. We keep treating these cells that come out of it. We don't treat the mother cell. In solid tumors, 5,000 subjects, 5,000 patients have been studied from the blood. It's all just a few drops of blood. What you're seeing is the size of a white blood cell in the blood and the size of these giant cells that you can track. Look at their shapes and sizes. They're called camels because they're cancer-associated macrophage-like cells. It proves my theory that it's a macrophage that joined with a tissue cell to form cancer. Look at the 10 most common cancers: breast, prostate, lung, colon. More than 90% patients are showing these. In some cases, 100% you show the presence of these giant cells. So I don't want to bore you with these details. They're always, if you don't find these giant cells after treatment, 100% patients are alive. If you find the giant cells after treatment, you know they're going to relapse. So basically, I'm saying these giant cells have been described for 200 years. They're found in liquid and solid tumors. They increase after therapy. They're implicated in resistance, metastatic disease. They're associated with all kinds of diagnosis, prognosis, progression-free survival, and overall survival. And they are therapeutic targets. We need to take them out. So the birth of the first cell, which is what you asked me, and this is why I took the time to answer you. I don't think cancer appears out of nowhere. I think there is a stress. I don't mean mental stress. I don't mean that you're feeling depressed or upset. Yes, that can also affect the immune system, which can be diminished because of mental stress. But I mean stress to an organ. For example, pancreatitis in the pancreas, or hepatitis in the liver, or any kind of colitis in the colorectal system. There's some infection, some exposure, some toxin, some autoimmune stress. That stress causes tissue cells to die. They get engulfed by macrophage. Instead of being phagocytosed and killed, the tissue cell fuses its genome with the macrophage genome, and a polyploid giant cell is born, and this PGCC express both epithelial and macrophage markers, and then depolyploidization with birth of diploid, aneuploid cells happens. I said, why am I the only one saying all this? I created a think tank, 30 leaders from academia and industry, leaders from the top institutions in the country, MD Anderson, Dana-Farber is the Harvard Cancer Center, University of Chicago, Johns Hopkins. I mean, these are the top centers, believe me. And industry I brought together. We had 17 two-hour-long meetings. We wrote an opinion paper that we must find ways to detect cancer much earlier last year in Scientific American. So basically, the conclusion of the think tank was we have to find this first cell, but where do you find it? Well, identify a group of individuals at high risk of cancer. One such group is cancer survivors. Did you know that 20% new cancers appear in someone who has already had one kind of cancer? Now, you may know someone who has cancer, you may have had cancer. Don't get anxious. Individual risk is very small. But when you look at actually diagnosed cases of cancer, then 1 in 5 have had a cancer. So if you do the math, in America, we diagnosed 1.8 million cases this year. Out of those, 350,000 will occur in a cancer survivor. So I propose that we should just have a center, which I created, where we collect blood, saliva, urine, feces, hair, and nails. We are doing that 5 to 10 cancer survivors every day at Columbia University. I'm simply banking their samples. Within a couple of years, we'll have 50,000 samples. 3,000 will develop a new cancer. And think of it. Now I have blood and urine passed through the filters already. So I can go back and see in these 3,000 patients, did I trap the first cell? And if yes, then we have to develop the technology to take it out. So remember, I was saying that this is the problem here. We take out only these cells. I'm saying at this point, after we kill the small cells, we should take the giant cell out. And so I propose a multi-step curative approach for cancer, not a 2-month improvement in survival, but cure. First, kill the small cells using whatever technology we have right now. Giant cells will survive. Now you come and target and kill the giant cells. If the concept is correct, recurrence will be prevented. In even someone presenting with stage 4 disease today can be cured, is what I'm saying. Target the giant cells at first appearance in cancer survivors to prevent cancer next. So both ends, end stage disease as well as prevent it in cancer survivors. As soon as you see the appearance of a giant cell, take it out so they don't develop cancer. So we are doing also looking for stress markers that actually allowed this to appear in the first place, forced the cancer cell to appear. What was that stress? We are trying to find that stress by doing proteomics, transcriptomics, metabolomics, glycomics, everything in 2 drops of blood. You can pick the stress markers, especially in those cancer survivors where we are trapping the first cell. We are also looking at these stress markers associated. In future, you won't even have to worry about giant cells. You just find the stress in a drop of blood and you try to mitigate that stress. So let me end by saying, I say that we should use blood as a window into disease. Just test blood for everything. You can detect giant cells, you can detect stress markers, target and eliminate the giant cells, mitigate and remove the stress causing the appearance. Now we have implantable devices, which I'm working on simultaneously with biomedical engineers at Columbia University. Have a tiny little chip, that can be inserted under the skin, implantable devices that will constantly monitor for stress markers and prevent rather than cure disease, be proactive rather than reactive. Let me end by saying why I do it and go back to Andrew for a minute. Andrew's mother, Elena, called me recently. And she said now her best friend has been diagnosed with the same stage 4 glioblastoma multiforme that her son died of. And do you know what she said to me? She said, Azra, I told her, I said, don't worry. It's been 5 years since our Andrew died. I'm sure Azra has developed new therapy to treat you now. My God, that came like a slap because 5 years have elapsed and I have done zero improvement. So the question I'm asking and ending with is, how many Andrews have to die before we open our eyes and say we are not making any difference by targeting the last cell? We have to go to the first cell. I hope I have convinced you. I will end by showing a 1-minute video to you that Andrew's sister Kat made. She is 1.5 years older than him. So she was 25 and he died at 23. Let us pay tribute to him and never forget the patients who are suffering before we end.
Thank you so much. You actually made me emotional. So let's go back to the scientific aspects. You clearly elaborated how the first cell was formed, and I, for one, learned a lot. So can I ask you to highlight some of the issues related to tumor microenvironment? Because in the live stream, I got questions from Umar bin Adnan, and they are pertaining to tumor microenvironment because Umar bin Adnan talks about iPSC induced pluripotent stem cells and computational techniques for studying cancer and their viability. So please highlight some of the aspects related to tumor microenvironment and why xenografts don't work generally.
I'm so sorry to say that I spent a lot of time trying to study the tumor microenvironment. And everything goes in waves and cycles of fashion. At one point, for example, it became very important to study the formation of new blood vessels, because the idea was that tumors grow by forming new blood vessels, because that's their only form of nutrition. So choking off the blood vessels will work. I spent so much time trying to study diseases, strategies that would block the formation of endothelial cells. Everything worked for people and animals. But when those same drugs were brought to the market, 0.00 responses. Another big thing in microenvironment, for example, is the cytokine, the proteins that cells use to talk to each other and to communicate what they should be doing next as a group. So I thoroughly studied this, the microenvironment for all the cytokines present, like TGF-beta, TNF-alpha, IL-1 beta, a whole battery of these cytokines. Spent years and years, and I have dozens of publications, by the way, on all these microenvironmental studies. Unfortunately, it's too complicated. By the time we diagnose cancer, microenvironment is extremely poisoned. It looks like a battleground. There are cells being born like crazy. There are cells dying like crazy. There's inflammatory cells arriving. There are cancer cells. There are endothelial cells. It will take us thousands of years, if ever we can understand. And this is what I keep saying, Jamshed, in the book. You might have noticed that it's our arrogance that we think we'll be able to understand the workings of a cell. Inside one cell, there are 1 trillion molecules, by the way. In one little bit of microenvironment, there are millions and millions of different kinds of molecules floating around. There are nerves, there are blood vessels, there are immune lymphatics. I mean, it's impossible. It's more complicated than the London Underground. So I'm saying, instead of trying to, it's an insult to try and simplify complexity. You know, Einstein said that you can simplify a matter to a certain point and then no simpler. Because in the end, you have to accept complexity. Accept the complexity, accept our inability to understand all of that, and try to simply prevent all of that from happening, is what I'm saying. Because I'm not interested in studying science and biology for itself. I'm interested in studying science and biology to benefit the patient.
Yes, that makes sense. Do you have time to take 2 more questions?
Of course, I have all the time. If I know we are over time, but please, I'm here for you.
Okay, excellent. Dania, please unmute yourself and ask your question directly.
My question is, can we replace the mutated gene in cancer patient, or would it be a great option to cure cancer?
Can we replace what gene?
Mutated gene. This
Mutated.
mutation.
Well, that's what we've been trying to do, Danya, for the last practically 50 years. That the model was that some gene is randomly mutated. As a cell doubles, it has to double its DNA as a cell is about to divide. And during that DNA doubling phase, the polymerase can make mistakes and put in the wrong nucleotide. And that mistake is called a mutation. So the whole model, the current accepted model of cancer is that as we age, our everything is becoming a little less efficient. And so the DNA polymerase is making more and more mistakes. And if that mistake happens, that mutation occurs in a vital gene, then that cell develops a life of its own and it starts growing without any concern for growth inhibitory signals, and it stops maturing. Those are the two fundamental features of cancer. So the idea was, if a mutation is initiating cancer, we should be able to find the magic bullet, because we should be able to target the cell with the mutation and the abnormal protein that mutated gene is making. Well, it was a good model because it worked in one case only. Chronic myeloid leukemia. There was a mutation, BCR-ABL translocation, that was making a chimeric new abnormal protein, and against that protein, you could make a drug. Gleevec was developed, and that is more than 25 years ago. And that proof that, yes, there was a mutation and you could correct that mutation seemed to prove a paradigm that this model is correct. So now everybody was saying, okay, what is the mutation in pancreatic cancer and how can we correct it? What's the mutation in ovarian cancer? Well, when we started looking in other cancer, there were too many mutations. So we said, oh, okay, let's sequence the whole human genome, and that will show us all the possible mutations in cancer, and that will help us cure cancer. Well, we sequenced the genome in 2000. How many cancers have we cured as a result? None, because there are too many mutations. So no, the answer to your question is a vehement no. You cannot think that one mutation is causing a deadly cancer and that you can cure it with one magic bullet. That model is finished.
Okay, so now my question is about your favorite works of fiction and your recommendations, because in this edition that I have on page 155, and let me quote directly, reading, okay, you say, and how do we deal with the grief once we lose them? Reading fiction, especially the classics of both Urdu and English. And then you talk about the value of fiction. So since this is a fiction book club, so please recommend us some of the works of fiction or other books that you want us to read, apart from The First Cell, your book.
Thank you so much, Jamshed, for recommending the book, Well, I read a lot, as you can see. I'm the owner of like 15,000 books. Every wall in my apartment is filled with books. And I read in two languages all the time, Urdu and English. I'm absolutely ravished by Urdu. I'm in love with Urdu poetry, Urdu prose. And there are many books that one can recommend and read. I suggest reading the classics always. Why? Because they are classics for a reason. Number one, they are addressing grand themes. Number two, their language is noble. And number three, the message they give is startlingly fresh for all times. So the classics of Urdu literature, for example, anything written by Manto, anything written by Qurratullain Haider, anything written by Ismat Chughtai, Munshi Prem Chand. Please try to read, just read it. In poetry, my two favorite poets in Urdu are Ghalib and Mir Anis. And then, of course, I love Mir Taqi Mir, but Anis and Ghalib, I would say, are my two favorite poets. The language again that each has used, and then the fikr in it, the thought process, asking universal questions of metaphysical importance, the asrar-e-azal. What are the essential mysteries of life? Who are we? Why are we here? Who created us? What is our purpose? These are the questions that the grand poets and the grand writers always ask. And then in English, I love Emily Dickinson, who I quote all the time. She's my hot favorite. And then in English literature, my favorite novels from which I learned a lot. Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov, Cervantes's Don Quixote, and Herman Melville's Moby Dick. These are I would say, my top three favorites. And then Beloved by Toni Morrison, 4. These books of fiction you must read. And in nonfiction, actually, my favorite book is called The Confessions, but there are 2 of them. Both are called The Confessions, and they're written 1,000 years apart. And I think it's important, though, the reason that Jamshed quoted those lines from my book about fiction, reading fiction, how can it help you practice medicine, for example? Well, reading fiction is, when you're reading a novel, you're introduced to characters. You have an immediate response to the character. You like them, you hate them, you don't care about them, etc. But as the characters undergo happiness, pain, trauma, whatever, you feel it because you are standing in their feet. So in a way, you're poaching on their experiences and experiencing all those things. And this is how reading fiction, you learn to understand why did you respond like this to that character. You learn about yourself. So you learn about others because you're now looking at the experience of someone over a lifetime, whereas you're living your life one day at a time. You can see whole generations, stories that evolve. And so you understand, if this character hadn't taken this action, but had taken that action, this would have been the consequence instead of that. So you learn to think in a wider way also. But reading poetry, what about reading poetry? Well, for example, Ghalib asks the question, Ibn Maryam hua kare koi. Who is Ibn Maryam? Christ, Hazrat Isa. He is famous for having raised the dead. Lazarus is a person who had died, and Jesus raised him from the dead. Ghalib is, what is Ghalib saying? Ibn Maryam hua kare koi, mere dukh ki dawa kare koi. Yes, you are able to raise someone from, even snatch them back from the jaws of death, but no one has the recipe to cure the hollowness of my heart, my existential angst. The question I'm asking myself all the time, why am I here? What am I doing in this world? What is the reason for my separation from God? These are the questions that help me understand the difference between cure and healing, between absence of disease and feeling well. There is a difference between those kinds of things. And reading poetry, asking yourself these kinds of questions, help me all the time. There's not a day that goes by when I don't read poetry, by the way, Urdu poetry.
Wonderful. And at the end, I would like your advice. What would you advise to our young scientists and other people like me? How can we become superhuman like you?
Oh God. I don't know about that, but listen, when my daughter was about 7 years old, we were living in Chicago, and I joined a club called the Mother Daughters series. And in this, mother and daughter can go and attend programs where women who can serve as role models appear. Because no child will ever take their mother to be the role model. No way. So I wanted to take my daughter and expose her to really grand women. And if you pay enough money, you could even have tea with them. So one time, we were, as a part of this series, we went to a program where we had tea with Maya Angelou, who's a great Black American writer and poet. She's been through a lot in her life. She died a few years ago. So Scheherazade, my daughter, asked her at tea, Miss Angelou, if there's one piece of advice you could give me, what would it be? And the advice that she gave to Scheherazade stuck with me, and I would like to give it to all of you. Maya Angelou said that, Scheherazade, people will forget what you say to them. People will even forget what you do to them, but they will never forget how you made them feel. And that is my advice to you. Always be sensitive to the feelings of others. No patient from my examining room can ever leave unless I'm sure that they are leaving happy and satisfied and not leaving in any way feeling disheartened. I think my daughter has followed that advice also, or to the best of her ability, and I try to follow that to the best of my ability, that in the end, we are all humans. Our quest in life must be to reduce the suffering and pain of humanity. And that doesn't mean only curing cancer. That means even in individual little conversations or little things, we must always be aware of other people's feelings.
Thank you so much. I think we should end here because I don't have better words to say. So all I can do is pray for you. Allah Ta'ala aapko sehat de and make you more successful in your endeavors. And you have totally convinced me about your thesis of this book. Thank you so much. Allah Hafiz.